Hi, Adam.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You're Adam Dean, political scientist at George Washington University, author of a new book published by Cambridge University Press called Opening Up by Cracking Down Labor Repression and Trade Liberalization in Democratic Developing Countries. And it raises a lot of issues about the plight of organized labor in an era of international trade and globalization and so on. And I want to get to as many of those as we can and use your book as a vehicle for doing that. But first, I should say, by way of full disclosure, you're a former student of mine.
And employee.
What's that?
And employee.
And employee. For a while, not for long. I guess you finally found a higher wage job, apparently. And when it was about 20 years ago, maybe spring of 2001. Were you at Penn then?
Yeah, it would have been spring of probably 2003, because I started in the fall of 2002.
See, I'm not sure that's possible, but we don't need to litigate that now. Anyway, were you a freshman?
I was a freshman. I took a class with you, and then I was your research assistant one summer.
Right. And I guess it goes without saying that had you not had a role model like me at an impressionable age, you wouldn't have amounted to much of anything, right?
I will say that one of the first things you had me do was to watch recordings of interviews you had done with professors, and then my job was to edit them down to little bits and categorize the topic. So it's exciting for me to be on the opposite end of one of these interviews.
To be an actual professor being recorded. Yeah, I guess I haven't advanced much over the last 20 years. Apparently, I'm still doing the same thing I was then. Oh, well.
But you're doing it very well.
Oh, I bet you say that to all the podcasters. So anyway, let me put a pin in a couple of issues that I want to get back to before we get into the specific argument in your book. Which is just that, obviously, these issues are important. Donald Trump was elected in no small part, I think, because of the perception, which I think was to some extent accurate, that American jobs, because of international trade, had gone to developing countries, most notably China. And I also want to say that, although I'm not in the habit of speaking highly of Donald Trump, he did in renegotiating NAFTA and creating what I call NAFTA 2, and he called something else, some other acronym. He actually came up with what I thought was a very interesting provision having to do with cars, the manufacture of cars that were eligible for preferable treatment under NAFTA, and the way, how many of what percentage of the parts had to be manufactured in factories that paid a certain wage. Because I thought that it was actually innovative in a certain way, and I want to talk about that as a possible example of the kind of thing that there needs to be more of if the impact on workers in, it'll have implications for workers in both developing and developed countries. And I want to get into that. Final thing I want to say is that we are now moving apparently toward a period of lower economic engagement with certain big low-wage countries like China. And that's going to have implications. And I think some American workers may welcome that. I think there are two sides of this coin. I think economic engagement has a number of virtues, including possibly reducing the chances of nuclear war or World War III. So, there's kind of something lost and something gained. It's a very complex set of issues. And your book approaches all this from a very interesting angle that probably a lot of people haven't thought about. So why don't you start off by telling us there's a view that has been prevalent in your area of kind of political economy that you're arguing against, right? Want to tell us what that view is?
Yeah, I would start off by saying that there were sort of two different conventional takes on the question of why developing countries opened up their economies in the 1980s and 1990s. The first one was that this was about the third wave of democratization. So you got democratization across the developing world, increasingly in the 80s and 90s. And the argument had been that free trade was going to increase wages and create new job opportunities for workers in developing countries. And so once you let the population vote in those countries, they sort of rationally anticipated that free trade would be beneficial. And so they voted for and demanded trade liberalization. They demanded the opening of their economy for their own economic well-being.
And what are some of the countries that you have in mind when you talk about developing countries that did or didn't open up?
Yeah, so almost all countries did eventually open. So that I'm not making an argument that it's wrong that countries open. Tariffs dropped, across the developing world during this period. It's really debate about how and why that happened.
Okay. So South America, India.
Yeah, the book looks most specifically at Argentina and India, but then also looks at Bolivia, Mexico, and Turkey. And that's in terms of like historical case studies. And then I do some statistical analysis of data from over 100 developing countries, basically almost all developing countries from the 1980s and 1990s, for which data on trade and different sorts of respect for workers' rights, things like that, for which data is available. And I'm able to support the argument, which I'm happy to talk more about, using both this sort of statistical analysis and qualitative historical analysis.
Okay. So the view had been that democratization facilitated the movement toward lower tariffs and economic engagement in these developing countries.
Yeah, and it's sort of a story, sort of end of history type story of like all good things going together. So democracy gives rise to free trade leads to like the alleviation of poverty, and it's this sort of like happy feedback loop. The sort of starting point for me in why I wanted to look more deeply at this question from a sort of critical point of view was that this idea that all workers in developing countries saw trade as a potential benefit and that they stood to gain from trade liberalization ignored what I had known sort of before I even started looking into this in depth, which was that labor unions in developing countries were really strongly opposed to these reforms. Mm-hmm. There was not only a segment of workers in developing countries, but the most highly organized and most politically powerful and relevant group of workers, which were on the other side of this. They were opposing these reforms.
Let's talk about why that is. And first, I want to say that, when you say the kind of refer to the end of history view that all good things go together, I guess the one exception was that surely there were people acknowledging, even within this framework, that in developed countries, at least some workers will be adversely affected. That was widely thought to be the case.
For sure. But the conventional view was that workers in the United States and other developed countries would be hurt by trade, and that workers in developing countries would benefit.
Which is intuitively, makes sense, because what's gonna hurt the workers in developed high-wage countries is the movement of work toward lower wage countries. And so now what I want to hear is, why was there the resistance of labor unions in the developing countries, since intuitively it makes sense that workers in those countries would benefit from lower tariffs?
Yeah, so you see two different things. One is that, the idea that countries were opening, is sort of skipping forward too much. This means that before they were closed. So for most of the 20th century, especially since World War II, many, many developing countries pursued a developmental strategy called import substitution industrialization. And this involved having really high tariffs to try to prop up and develop new industries. So think about Argentina and India. These countries in the 80s, when it came time for them when they started to pursue opening the economy, they had these industries that weren't going to be able to compete. Very similar to the logic in the United States, right? Where the steel industry, the auto industry, the furniture industry, the textile industry, lots of industries in the United States had a hard time competing with cheaper imports. So also India and Argentina, these were countries that had slowly built up and protected industries like the auto industry, like the steel industry, especially. And these industries were not going to be able to compete once they lowered tariffs. And the unions representing workers in those industries recognized that. Okay. And they lobbied very strongly and protested and launched general strikes to try to block those reforms, knowing that it would lead to lower wages and massive layoffs for workers in the industry.
So is it the case that there were workers in most of these countries that benefited, but they tended not to be unionized? Like all of the clothing labels that said, made in Guatemala. I mean, I know that's not a case study of yours, but you know what I mean. Did those tend to be like not unionized because they had never been protected industries or something?
Yeah. So the basic idea is that in developing countries, if you subset it just into very sort of simplified terms, import competing and export oriented industries, there were enormous gains for export oriented industries in developing countries, like the imports from China. The import competing industries lost. Mm-hmm. Employers in that industry knew that. Unions representing workers in those industries knew that. The problem is that the workers in export-oriented industries very rarely, if ever, had unions, mm-hmm. and never had a sort of commitment from their employers that wages would rise with the profits of those industries. So workers in those industries were often very skeptical that they would actually share in the benefits. Employment opportunities would increase, but this idea that wages were going to rise in those industries, slowly over decades or generations, we've seen wage increases. But workers in those industries had very little political power, was not organized. And even when they were never very confident that they would share in those benefits. So what that meant was that unions, as a sort of like umbrella organization, like the AFL-CIO, your listeners probably will be most familiar with here, but these sort of labor federations in India and Argentina and Bolivia and Mexico and lots of countries, they're sort of like representing workers throughout the economy. And it's those old protectionist unions in the industries that we're going to lose, like the steel industry, that had the largest voice in those confederations. And so those confederations as a whole often came out very strongly against trade liberalization, even if in the background there was the potential for benefit for other workers that weren't union.
Okay. So these politically powerful unions, sometimes politically powerful in developing countries, often oppose trade liberalization, and yet it often happened. And that's what one thing you explain in the book. How did that happen?
Yeah. So the first point was to say, look, there were these unions that were opposed, and so it's not so simple to just say democracy empowers workers. Workers wanted free trade. End of story. We have to reckon with unions that were opposed and how their opposition was overcome. And so that actually takes us to a sort of, this might be a little confusing, but there's another conventional wisdom in a separate field. So that first one was sort of from international relations or international political economy. And then this other sort of silo of political science called comparative politics, or even more narrowly, comparative political economy. People had long recognized that unions in developing countries were going to oppose these kinds of reforms. So there's sort of blinders. All scholars have their own theoretical blinders. In this other region of the field, people knew unions were going to oppose. In fact, it was the reason for many years that scholars had argued that democratic developing countries were not going to open their economies because they were going to face all this opposition. The dictatorships of Pinochet in Chile that could, and did very brutally repress the opposition. Those countries opened first, Pinochet in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. So for many years, people thought democracy was going to be an impediment because of the inability to repress the opposition in order to open up. And so,
I'm curious, just did people like Pinochet, the first thing that comes to mind is that they're working on behalf of industrialists, on behalf of capital when they opened up. As a political matter, did they happen to often also court support from was that it? Was that kind of the extent of the constituency that was driving liberalization?
I'm not an expert on the case of liberalization in Chile, but I don't think anybody would argue that Pinochet had broad support from the population for anything he did. Again, I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't think of Pinochet as responsive to the average worker in Chile. That would certainly be beyond the pale. It was a brutal dictatorship. But I will say that in democratic countries, following a transition to democracy, I'm relatively agnostic on the demands for free trade. So I think you're right that these export-oriented businesses were definitely lobbying for, and there's clear evidence of that, that they wanted trade liberalization for their own economic benefits. But it's also the case there's evidence from public surveys in the 80s and 90s showing that trade liberalization was, not unanimously popular, but often had something like a majority support. And there's lots of different reasons why that might be. Like that first conventional story we talked about was that they rationally anticipated that free trade would increase their wages and employment opportunities. But there's also this idea that there were economic crises, high inflation in the 80s. People came to see any kind of reform as better than the status quo, even if they didn't think it was going to directly benefit them in those ways. And then there's also the idea of ideology. This is like the age of neoliberalism, the spread of Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, "There is no alternative." So there was broad support for these reforms, but from the public, and there was organized support and demands from export-oriented businesses or capitalists. So those people were pushing for openness.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to make is that unions were pushing against. Unions were very strongly opposed.
Okay.
And so in that sort of second conventional story we talked about that recognizes that unions were opposed, they started off with this comparison with Pinochet and the dictatorships to say democracies can't repress like dictatorships. To repress is to become an authoritarian regime. So how did democracies end up opening? Because they did. In the 80s, the early 90s, they started opening. So scholars started puzzling about what were the menu of options? How did democratic governments, who by definition they said can't repress, end up overcoming this opposition from unions? And they came up with a long list of different things. Sometimes it was the unions were aligned with the political parties, so they had loyalty to a labor-backed party. They trusted them to make these reforms that must be necessary. Other people sort of praised the genius of the political leader, how they obfuscated what was really going on and tricked the opposition. And then the real prominent one is probably welfare compensation, that democracies recognize that some people are going to be hurt by reform, and so they offer them a safety net, job retraining, unemployment benefits, different things to sort of soften the dislocation from free trade. And so there's this impressive, list of different things that democratic governments did, and there's evidence that all of those things were done. The point I try to make in the book is that there was also a very strategic use of labor repression to weaken labor unions, to silence their opposition, and to facilitate the process of trade liberalization. And that labor repression has been basically completely written out of the stories that we write, the stories that we teach our students. And so this book is a sort of revisionist account, both theoretically in terms of the moving pieces of the politics of globalization, but then also empirically sort of setting the record straight about what really happened in these democratic countries in terms of overcoming union opposition. And that labor repression is often, a pretty sordid affair, arresting union leaders. Happy to go into the details.
Yeah, what is the array of tools? I assume there's a spectrum of relatively benign, well, maybe so benign that repression is a slightly misleading word. I don't know. All the way to harsh. You open the book with somebody blowing up somebody's car. That's not nice. Fortunately, I think nobody died, right? Well, that was in Argentina.
It was in Argentina. It was a bomb blowing up the car of the head of the Labor Union Confederation, a man named Saul Ubaldini. This happened in 1989.
Was the idea that he wouldn't be in the car, they were just sending a message, or were they trying to kill him, or do we know?
The people I spoke with in Argentina, I was there in 2019, right before the pandemic started. And, I spoke with different union leaders that had known Ubaldini. Ubaldini passed away in the early 2000s. But I got to meet his son, who's also named Saul Ubaldini. It was very helpful introducing me to the old labor union leaders that his father had been friendly with, as well as the chauffeur and bodyguard who parked the car the night that it blew up. There's never any investigation. It's hard to say definitively who planted the bomb or what the intent was. Some scholars I spoke with said that it was best to see this as a threat to what would happen. People who continued to oppose the president's trade liberalization and other economic reforms. And another Argentine labor union leader who said that he'd also lived through many death threats throughout his years, especially during the dirty war, during the dictatorship in the late 70s and early 80s. And he said to me very chillingly, he said, in this country, if they want to kill you, they kill you. So he was a little dismissive, believe it or not, of the car bomb. But I think the timing of the car bomb is really crucial. So what's basically going on here, this is to back up a little bit, this is in Argentina in 1989, and it's basically at the very beginning of the presidency of Carlos Menem, who's just the second elected democratic president of Argentina after the return of democracy in 1983. So from 83 to 89, there's a president named Raúl Alfonsín, and he tries throughout his presidency, throughout 6 years, to open up the Argentine economy, to lower tariffs, to privatize a lot of industries. And these reforms that he's proposing trigger a wave of general strikes from Saúl Ubaldini and his labor union called the CGT. There's actually 13 general strikes throughout the 6-year presidency that basically paralyze the economy during the strikes and lead Alfonsín to back down. And at the end of his presidency, tariffs are almost the same that they were when he started his presidency in 83. So when Carlos Menem is elected and he announces that he's going to try to implement the same kind of reforms, it's very clear to him and everyone in Argentina that Ubaldini and the unions are going to oppose these reforms just like they had for years, and that they're going to pose a real challenge, a real obstacle to implementing the reforms. And so what happens with that bomb is it's during the first few months of Menem's presidency where he's very clearly trying to oust Ubaldini from the union. He offers him first some benign things. He says, you could be an ambassador overseas to the ILO. You could be an ambassador, I think, to Spain at one point he offers him. At one point, the front page of the newspaper says, today, Menem didn't offer Ubaldini a single ambassadorship. This is sort of like, comical coverage in the press that Menem is clearly trying to get rid of him. Then it starts to get a little bit more intense. And Menem tries to remove Ubaldini through various means of labor repression. So despite Menem being very clear that he wants Ubaldini out, and there are some union leaders siding with him, the union has a vote in 1989 and decides to keep Ubaldini as the head of the union, even though Ubaldini is clearly opposing these reforms and Menem is calling for his ousting. Then, after he's won this vote, Menem negotiates with some union leaders. They should have a new meeting to decide whether or not they should change the rules of the unions to have a new vote to oust Ubaldini, right? So he's just won re-election. The president is meddling in union affairs in this way. And it's the night before that meeting where union leaders are going to decide, should we change the rules to try again to oust this union leader the president doesn't want? It's the night before that meeting that the car blows up.
Now, that's weird because you can imagine that working two ways, right? I mean, you can imagine the union rank and file. Were they going to do the voting on this?
It's the leaders of different unions in the confederations. I think.
Oh, I see. Then I get the message. It's like we're capable of blowing up the cars of union leaders. How do you want to vote?
Yeah. So then the next morning they vote and they say like, okay, let's change the rules, and like 2 months from now we'll have another vote to see whether or not Ubaldini can still be the president. And then during those next few months, cabinet ministers of Menem's administration start to meddle again and pressure labor unions. So it was a close vote. This is important to keep in mind. Ubaldini won that first vote 53% to 47%. So Menem only had to shift a few votes one way or the other. And so they do this in two ways. One, the Minister of Labor simply replaces the head of several unions in Argentina, which is a clear violation of workers' rights.
What did not even comply with law in Argentina?
It's debatable when the government itself is the one doing this, whether or not it's a violation.
And we should say that in your book, when you talk about repression, you mean a spectrum of things ranging from clear violation of the national laws to things that don't violate the national laws, but do violate international labor standards as articulated by, for example, the United Nations and so on, right?
Yeah, or the ILO most specifically.
Okay.
Right? So these are like, if there's a country where workers don't have the right to strike.
Which is the International Labor Organization. Is that not under the UN's auspices, or a lot of things technically are, but anyway.
So it's so it's a range of things, arresting people for striking is a violation of labor rights, even if the government is doing it, right? So the point is like, if a government does not protect the right of workers to have a union, then that's a violation of labor rights that ought to exist, right? So it's not just looking at violations of the country's laws. So anyway, so they intervene and they replace the heads of some unions. And then there's another new program in Argentina at this point. Workers used to have money deducted from their paychecks and go direct to the union to pay for different sort of like social welfare benefits that were administered by the union. Under Menem, they changed this. Instead of going right to the union, it goes to the government first, and then the government distributes to the unions. And the cabinet minister or from the Menem administration who's in charge of this program called Obras Sociales clearly uses this as like a stick threatening union leaders. And all of the union leaders I spoke with in 2019 remembered this very clearly, threatening union leaders that if they didn't vote the right way against Ubaldini, that they would withhold these funds that are supposed to go to the union. With those, those are instances of labor repression. It's the manipulation of union funds by the government, the replacing of union leaders by the government, and then the car bomb, obviously. And after that, they have a vote, and Ubaldini loses, this time 47 to 53, and the union movement splits. After it splits in half, half of it continues to be led by Ubaldini, who again had been like the symbol of opposition to neoliberalism throughout the 1980s. And the Argentine press during this period still thinks very clearly that Ubaldini and his labor union confederation, which includes the metal workers, the largest, this highly protectionist labor union in the country, that they still pose a huge threat to Menem's reforms, that they're going to launch a general strike, just like they had in the earlier 80s, to block the reforms. And then the rest of that chapter in my book goes through like a litany of strategic uses of labor repression. So first, the Menem administration declares individual strikes to be illegal when unions aligned with Ubaldini say that they're going to go on strike. They arrest workers that go on strike. They decertify unions that go on strike, so they're no longer legally recognized. There's a sit-down strike at the telecommunications company. Menem breaks it with the military. He sends in the military to carry people out, which is it was a very shocking thing in Argentina just 7 years after the return of democracy from a military dictatorship, to have a democratic president break a strike with the military. And then ultimately, the Ubaldini faction announces a general strike, and they vote unanimously to have this general strike. And Menem declares that strikes are illegal in the public sector, which is the heart of Ubaldini's support. And so, like all of these are instances of labor repression that have been written out of the story about the ways in which Menem overcame the opposition of unions in Argentina. The conventional story has just been to say that unions went along with the reforms, and they ignore those first year and a half of Menem's administration, where he splits the union movement in half and then slowly whittles down the unions that continued to oppose his reforms.
Okay. So let me ask a question about this as compared with labor in developed countries. So in a certain sense, they were, these unions in Argentina and in some other developing countries were in the same situation as American unions, threatened by international trade, let's say the United Auto Workers or something. Now, my understanding is that although there have been times in American history when the federal government got heavy-handed with labor and broke up strikes and so on, I don't recall a lot of that. Now, it may be that the trade liberalization in our country was already pretty well in place. Like we already had low tariffs, and then the competition kind of snuck up on our unions in the sense that it took a while to kind of, build the factories in developing countries and infuse the workers with the know-how and so on. So is that the reason that the story seems to have, because as I recall, what happened with American unions was that they just slowly lost power because the companies increasingly had the option of, well, they could move stuff offshore. They could just say, look, we're competing with Toyota, man. We can't keep selling cars and paying this much and so on, right? So
it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Basically, why and how did this play out differently in developed countries? And I think the most relevant period to compare it to in the United States is actually in the 1940s. when the US like really decides to open up for the first time, right? So rather than this kind of like creeping liberalization later on, in the 40s, the 30s and the 40s, there's this real decision by the Roosevelt administration to open up, right? So the United States had had very, very high tariffs basically since its founding, certainly throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, and really decides to open up with what's called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act under the Roosevelt administration. In the 1940s, there's this big debate about whether or not to reinstate it, to pass it again, to continue liberalizing trade. So there's this big debate in the 40s amongst labor unions about what to do. And the main difference between unions in the United States in the 40s and the developing countries I talk about in the 80s and 90s is that you had powerful unions in the United States in exporting industries. So like think about the auto industry, the steel industry in the 1940s, you've got like the CIO, the UAW, the United Steelworkers. You've got these very powerful unions in export industries, which again, we talked about earlier, it's basically non-existent in developing countries in the 1980s and 1990s. Those unions with like very clear commitments from their employers to share profits with their workers. So if Ford and GM have a great year, if the steel companies have a great year, wages are going to rise for those unionized workers. So you have confidence and support for free trade from unions in the United States. Mm-hmm. There were also unions in the 40s that were protectionist, that thought they wouldn't be able to compete after opening. And those unions lobbied for trade protection, just like the unions that I talk about in Argentina and India. The issue, though, is that within the labor movement, you have this split, some opposed to trade and some in favor, which mm-hmm. meant that the overall balance of labor's position sort of balance each other's out sort of, right? So whereas, Menem, like I was talking about, or in India in the 90s, democratic leaders had to think about like how to overcome union opposition. In the US in the 40s, there was sort of like a split labor ticket, you could think of it as. And because of them balancing each other out, there was no need to repress the protectionist unions. They were sort of counterbalanced by the pro-trade unions. Mm-hmm. And there are sort of structural reasons why that was possible in the United States. It's a dominant, industrial powerhouse in the 40s. Most of Western Europe's economy had been destroyed by the war. And so there was like, just enormous amounts of profits to be made and to be shared with workers who had unions that had been supported by the New Deal. And so there's all these contingencies in the background. And then, the reasons why those kinds of unions, powerful unions, are absent in developing countries, again, is a structural issue of sort of global competition and low value added labor intensive industries where the profit margins are very small. And the developmental strategy is to make sure that wages stay quite low.
Okay. So now, you want to just kind of quickly allude to the story in India before we move on to the issues that we're now confronted with by virtue of how this is all played out? Because there are that's one of your big case studies. There's some contrast with Argentina, right?
Yeah, India is another case where, so like in Argentina, there's a transition to democracy, but for India, it's with independence back in the 1940s. And there's many, many decades of high tariffs and powerful labor unions in India. And then in the 1980s, there's a prime minister named Rajiv Gandhi who proposes opening up the Indian economy, privatizing many public industries, and it triggers general strikes, just like in Argentina in the 80s. And those general strikes contribute to Rajiv Gandhi backing down, leaving tariffs where they were. Fast forward a few years to Narasimha Rao, a new prime minister in the early 1990s. He launches this very similar set of economic reforms called the New Economic Policy, lower tariffs, privatization, and other neoliberal economic reforms. And again, it leads to a series of general strikes by labor unions in India. And whereas Rajiv Gandhi had allowed those general strikes to take place without really cracking down on workers' rights to organize and strike like that, Narasimha Rao, looking back on what happened in the 80s, decides to take a very different path. And so what he does in 1992, in the days leading up to a general strike against his reforms, he starts to use the Indian government starts to use what's called the power of preventive arrest, which your listeners might recognize from Tom Cruise's movie Minority Report. In India, inherited from the common law tradition from Britain and enshrined in the Indian constitution. The government has the right to arrest people that they suspect will break the law in the future.
That's convenient.
It's convenient for breaking a strike. And so what they did was the week before, in the days leading up to the general strike, they detained 25,000 union members around the country and hold them in prisons in various parts of the country until the general strike is done. And then they let them go without any charges. And the purpose,
of course, that does lead to a kind of a labor slowdown, doesn't it? I mean, isn't it a de facto strike when you lock up every worker in an industry?
So I had the same puzzle, and I had to work through it in the archives. Basically, what's going on is they're arresting mostly the transportation union workers, and what they do during general strikes in India is to picket the main train stations and bus stations to try to shut down the transportation system. And when they shut down the transportation system through picketing that way, then nobody can go to work and be able to claim, like exponentially more people stayed away from work and joined the strike. And so in the Indian press before and after these general strikes, there are debates about how big the strike is going to be in anticipation. And then after the strike, there's debates about how big it was. And there's agreement on both sides, right or wrong, that this is a barometer, the size of the strike is a barometer for public opinion on the reforms. And as you go over time, there's a series of general strikes. There was actually a prior one in 1991 that wasn't repressed. And so in 92, they're debating, is this strike going to be bigger or smaller? And so this decision to preventively arrest people, to stop them from picketing, to make sure that the strike is a little bit smaller, they're hoping to make it smaller than the previous one. The government can then claim, look, the strikes are getting smaller over time. We're winning the battle of ideas about these economic reforms. The working class is coming on our side. But in the background there, and again, a story that's been totally ignored in like huge literature on Indian reform. This is one of the cases where people most famously say that Narasimha Rao, the democratically elected prime minister, was like a reform genius, that he obfuscated what was going on. He confused people about what he was doing. He made it unclear what the consequences would be. And people tell that story without acknowledging that 25 million people joined a general strike against the reforms, and that those strikes would have been even larger if not for this really strategic and draconian use of a draconian law to preventively arrest people, to very clearly, meddle and restrict workers' rights to protest.
So how does this story end in India?
They open up with those strikes under control, and the government increasingly able to claim that worker opposition is drying up because they're being convinced that the reforms are the only way to go. Narasimha Rao slashes tariffs by over 50%. It opens up the Indian economy, and the unions never recover in Argentina or India. And this is one thing I want to flag. I'm happy to go back to these three questions you mentioned earlier, but one thing I want to put on the agenda is the long-term consequences of this. So there can be debates about, there are obviously debates about what the consequences of opening were. We've already talked about these cleavages within workers, right? That some workers in these unions were going to lose out, and hundreds of thousands of them lost their jobs. But the creation of new jobs and export industries did create jobs and at some point higher wages for lots of other workers, right?
Yeah, I mean, somewhat famously, there's been a pretty radical reduction of poverty in China and India during the period of trade liberalization, and clearly to some extent as a consequence of it, right?
Yep, and I think what one of the main goals of the book is to say that there are there's like another side of the ledger that's been ignored. For those people who are convinced that this was for the greater good, that it alleviated poverty, that it increased employment, that it raised wages, that's fine. People can debate that, but my point is, and without arguing against that necessarily, I'm saying there was also this repression that took place. And so descriptively, we want to set the record straight. Normatively, I think most people would agree that it's problematic for a democracy to be repressing labor unions in this way. And then the longer term consequences, if we're going to acknowledge, the potential alleviation of poverty as a positive, we also have to think about the long-term consequences of labor repression and the weakening of labor unions in developing countries with democratic governments. And one of those long-term consequences may be the erosion of democracy itself. Unions played crucial roles in the struggle for democracy in many developing countries, and then in the sustaining of democracy for many years. The weakening of unions, many scholars point to as an enabling condition for the rise of the far right and the erosion of democracy. Partially because unions are less able to mobilize workers to the polls, partially because weaker unions are unable to support provide higher wages and less income inequality that might inoculate people against far right appeals. But in various ways, the weakening of unions is linked to the erosion of democracy itself. So that broader question of the pros and cons of globalization and the process through which developing democracies opened up in the 80s and 90s, if we're going to put the alleviation of poverty on the positive side, I think we have to put the normative downside of repression on the negative side. And then it's, the jury's still out on whether or not the long-term consequences of the democratic strategy for opening up, one of the consequences might be the erosion of democracy itself.
Okay. And then there's another negative side, which is better known, which is, again, the effect on some workers in developed countries and the kind of internal political implications of that. I mean, the election of Donald Trump is an extreme example, but and was contingent on a number of things. But you can pretty well predict that trade liberalization may lower the wages of a substantial number of workers, or make the wages rise less than they otherwise would have, and perhaps increase economic inequality within that country, and lead to some kind of political backlash, and be kind of destabilizing, and so on. And I guess that's what I had been focused on as I wrote about, to the extent that I did write about trade in like the 90s as NAFTA happened and so on. And my hope, and by the way, I think that the class I taught of that you were in, and I believe this was the first college course I'd ever taught. I haven't taught many of them. I'm not a credentialed academic, but the dean of the college at Penn had read a book of mine, and we wound up talking, and he said, "Do you want to teach a class?" And I think because I never taught a class, I thought, well, let's start out the easy way. I'll basically have them read a book I've written very slowly, so that can consume a lot of seminar time, and I won't have to. Anyway, I'm pretty sure you read Nonzero, and an argument I made in Nonzero was that the way to, as I recall, at least, it's been a long time, the way to handle the tension I'm describing between the various benefits of international trade, which I think are many, and the downside that was most apparent to me at the time, which is the impact on workers in developed countries, was transnational governance. In other words, okay, you do the trade deals like NAFTA, but you also make those agreements, meaningful forums for negotiating with labor in ways that reduce the impact, that kind of slow the disruption down, if nothing else. And of course, there was some of that in NAFTA nominally, right? It was done by a Democratic administration. They had to at least nod to labor. In those days, I mean, now, labor's allegiance is less clearly and obviously attached to the Democratic Party. Back then, it pretty much was. So they had these things, but they weren't very meaningful, right? And I mean, first of all, and I want to get back to this Trump thing, because I think it is, however small and modest it may be, and however little impact it may even had, I think qualitatively, it's kind of an interesting kind of thing. But first, I want to say that your book may resolve a little bit of a puzzle, or a little bit of tension within my own argument. I mean, I remember when I used to say, well, we should build meaningful labor accords into things like NAFTA, I would hear, and I heard it from a U.S. senator at the time, said it directly. He said, no, I mean, you don't understand. I mean, the whole reason for these, The whole reason these things are appealing at both ends is because of the reduction in labor costs you get by moving things to the low wage countries. And that is the source of their appeal in the developing countries, right? And that suggested that there's going to be zero political support for what I want in the developing countries. But your argument suggests that, well, maybe it's a little more than you might think. There actually is a part of the labor, there is organized labor in these countries that would like to slow things down and like for these transitions to happen a little more slowly, right?
Yeah, they'd like the transitions to happen more slowly. And this happened during NAFTA. There were transnational, efforts of unions in the US and Mexico and Canada to try to build some kind of coalition to revise to influence the negotiations of NAFTA. But it was one, to slow it down, to slow the transition for workers in Mexico that were going to be harmed, but also to institute meaningful labor reform that would allow the workers in the new export industries to actually capture some of those gains. So there are debates about, like, if the whole developmental model is that wages will stagnate as productivity and profits rise, then that's not going to actually benefit workers. And so there were arguments about, how do we make sure that we don't just become like a permanent low-wage platform for export to the United States? And people are, unions in Mexico were arguing for unions that would increase wages along with productivity to make sure that they shared in the benefits of NAFTA in Mexico. But none of that came about in the 1990s.
Can I ask you, do you know which kinds of sectors these unions were in Mexico?
Yeah, there was an independent union called, so Mexican labor politics is very complicated. I'm actually on my way to Mexico City later this afternoon to do some field work. There are the main official union is affiliated with the PRI, the dominant party in Mexico for many years.
Yeah.
And then there's independent unions that aren't aligned with the government, and a lot of independent unions were fighting against NAFTA, and they were mostly in the maquila sector. So these export-oriented, low-wage factories.
Did that include auto parts?
The FOT was small, and I think represented some auto workers and also some like textile garment type workers.
The maquiladora was a term for factories located near the border that became, I think, eligible for particularly preferential treatment or something. Is that what you mean by maquila? They had located near the U.S. border.
Yep. And yeah, the argument was, look, if the idea is just to create employment here, but wages are never going to rise, that's going to, only be a limited benefit for Mexican workers. And so there were unions arguing for something like what's happened today. So I do want to say, I've been talking with people from the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office lately, and they're extremely enthusiastic about the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0 you talked about earlier, and like the real teeth that they think it has for bringing cases against the violation of labor rights in Mexico in a way that, like you said, nominally there was this side agreement to NAFTA on labor, but there was really no teeth, no real enforcement capacity. And then even in CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement signed in the 2000s, there was again an effort to make those things a little bit stronger, but they still failed. Someone from the USTR told me about a case that they brought against Guatemala that went on for 8 years and ultimately was lost. But under the USMCA, there's this rapid response, I think it's called, mechanism to like really bring cases of when the laws in Mexico have been violated in Mexico, you can bring a case. And they claim they've been very successful so far. They've already won at least 6 cases in a short period of time, compared to bringing one case that loses over 8 years. There's a lot of enthusiasm about that maybe they've gotten it right this time, and that trade agreements between the U.S. and Mexico, and obviously Canada too is included, will finally be a mechanism to actually meaningfully increase labor rights in Mexico. But again, the jury is still out on that.
And just to be clear about the political logic from the point of view of American workers, is to the extent that unions are empowered in Mexico through this mechanism or others, they can probably wind up getting paid a little more in the long run. And that reduces the competition that American workers face.
That's right.
Now, as I said, there's another approach to that that was built into USMCA or NAFTA 2. And it was this thing, and you know more than I do about whether this wound up having any consequence, but it was just interesting in its nature. It was this, like, there was a rule that for a car to qualify for the treatment, the fair, within NAFTA free trade treatment within these three countries, nearly half of the parts, 45% or something, had to be built in factories paying at least $16 an hour. And that, I guess, I assume, kind of confronts, some Mexican factory owners with a choice. You can either, at least on the margins, in some cases, you can either pay this much money or see some of your these parts made in the U.S. or Canada instead, because the car makers are going to require, the logic is kind of obvious, I guess. Now, I don't know if that wound up mattering much, but interestingly, it was, I think, favored by the Mexican government, which at that point was a left-wing government, Obrador, right? And I assume that was because there were unions that would benefit that were associated with him, but I don't know what was the deal there. Do you know?
I don't know the specific details of the percentage of a car's parts that need to be in under the USMCA, but I think the logic that you're laying out, of a regulation like that is clear, that it would, sort of level the playing field for workers in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that the thing that people are most excited about, and again, I'm like just starting to delve into the Mexican labor politics recently, is this new law that was passed, I think, in 2019 by the López Obrador government, which is going to hopefully make it easier for independent unions to compete against these old official unions, enabling a sort of like more aggressive independent unions that will actually represent workers. So a lot of the concerns about these old official unions is that the contracts they negotiate are sometimes what are called protection contracts, where the whole point of the contract is to basically make sure that you don't get an actual union that would fight for workers' working conditions and wages in that factory.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to oust a union once it's represented. And so the new law is going to require, it goes into effect May 1st, 2023. It's going to require workers in factories that have a collective bargaining agreement on the books, that they're going to have to vote whether or not they want to keep that contract. And many workers don't even know that they have a contract, right? Because it's these background protection type contracts. And so that's going to wipe the slate clean and create a competitive environment in which independent unions might arise to represent workers and actually fight much more aggressively to increase wages for Mexican workers. And that would then again, through the building of independent unions that are willing to represent the demands of rank and file workers more, would again increase wages for Mexican workers and help to level that playing field between Mexico and the United States and Canada.
And I guess, my Econ 101 professor would insist that I point out that there are always these complicated trade-offs within countries. I mean, people rightly point out that a minimum wage may, while raising, the quality of life for the majority of workers, leave some number of workers who would have had a job out of employment. There can be those kinds of dynamics, I'm sure, to the extent that they exist. And people argue, of course, about how strong they are and whether, how or negligible they are.
I think a lot of recent research suggests that there's not a trade-off, that you can increase.
No trade-off at all?
I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that a lot of like the carefully done research looking at like across states, some that have increased, some that haven't, matching work across the states, that there's very little, if any, trade-off in employment. But, under certain circumstances, and as you said, it's a debated topic, but it's certainly not the sort of shibboleth that it used to be, right? That it was just like understood that increasing the minimum wage had this terrible consequence of lowering employment.
Right.
That's no longer the commonly held view.
Yeah. Anyway, I was going to say that to the extent that these dynamics exist, they would exist within Mexico, and to the extent that you raise the floor, there may be a few people who drop off of it or whatever. But that's just an asterisk. The larger point is that it is in the interest of workers in developing countries to see that, well, first of all, the actual labor laws in developing countries are enforced. But secondly, to see that kind of the labor standards, just like right to organize, right, that are recognized nominally internationally, actually apply in developing countries. And look, in some sense, the logic, the incentive is self-serving in developed countries. But the fact is it's there. So there is this, there is this kind of workers of the world unite dynamic. And there is a commonality of interest between a large number of, say, American workers and a large number of Mexican workers. And I've always thought that to the extent that they use vehicles like NAFTA to do this work, it gives NAFTA some buy-in from labor and people who want to see free trade, broadly speaking, flourish. That is to say, economic engagement between countries grow, both because, it does, according to fairly standard economic reasoning, raise aggregate prosperity, leaving aside how that is divided, right, within the country, but it raises aggregate prosperity. I think it has pacifying effects in terms of making war less likely. But if you believe those things, you should, I think, favor these trade agreements becoming the fora for actual meaningful discourse leading that actually has concrete impact on labor law and the enforcement of labor law, right?
I think that's right, and the people who are excited about the USMCA are very critical of the previous attempts at doing this at CAFTA and NAFTA. That you're right, it helped get some buy-in. The labor and environmental side agreements in NAFTA helped to get some buy-in. Clinton could say look, we did something. But in terms of the agreements actually having some teeth that are some real enforceability, people seem again, who are much more expert on this than me, seem to think that they really are getting it right now for the first time with the USMCA.
Well, that's very encouraging. And, to give Clinton some credit, just the fact of putting it on paper, regardless of whether it had teeth, that was a precedent and allowed people to say, hey, this wasn't shit, man. We have to get serious, and that's part of the process of the evolution of international governance. But, I think I wrote a long piece for Wired that I think roughly no one read. It was in the actual physical Wired in the magazine a couple of years ago called, I think, Make Globalism Great Again or something. And it was about, I drew attention to some of the things Trump was doing in the context of NAFTA too. But the argument was look, if you are terrified by a Trumpist, highly nationalist movement, you should want to direct some of the energy behind it to these transnational bodies and convince some of the people in Trump's base that they can actually get some of what they want through, a kind of transnational governance that is associated with globalism, which Trump would say he hates. And of course, Trump explicitly says he hates global governance. He explicitly says he hates international governance. And yet he participated in an actual, I would say, improvement of it. So there's that.
Yeah. I mean, I also share your hesitancy in praising former President Trump in any way. And I won't, but I will say that the people at the Department of Labor and the USTR that I see as progressive, sort of left advocates for sort of rebalancing globalization, thinking critically about how globalization, specifically trade with the United States, could be used to increase respect for workers' rights in developing countries, that they are extremely excited about the mechanisms made possible by the USMCA.
Mm-hmm. And in principle, this can be replicated in whole other economic fora. we wound up opting out of the Trans-Pacific thing, and I have no idea what the substance of that was, but this kind of logic can be applied in principle to a revised version of that or anything else. I mean, I think we're a ways away from a global minimum wage. I won't live to see that, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a critical part of anybody's agenda, but I think it's really important that these transnational agreements of various kinds start meaningfully recognizing the interests of labor and the environmental stuff too, but that's a separate topic.
Yeah, it's a separate topic. I think I'll just say that one of the ways that my book fits in with this broader conversation about USMCA and bringing labor rights into trade agreements more is that it gives hopefully some ammunition to people that see the need for globalization to change to accomplish these goals, right? So like that earlier conventional wisdom we talked about like democracy feeding to free trade, which automatically raises wages for workers throughout the developing world. Like in that mindset, there's like very little need for this, right? Like free trade in developing countries or trade liberalization in developing countries is going to like increase wages and working conditions for workers through market forces sort of automatically. And so like this sort of revisionist account of like, no, that's not at all, the full story. There's this history of labor repression, even by democratic governments, that sort of like what happened in countries during this process, I think is like an important background for thinking about why something like these rapid response mechanisms are so important today.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, congratulations on everything. Congratulations on the book, which has been out, what, a few weeks or a couple months or what?
A couple of months now. It came out early October.
Uh-huh. Good. And you're happy with the feedback?
Yeah, it's been fun. This is my second book. I wrote one in 2016, which I won't go into detail about now, but
well, go ahead and plug the title at least.
That first book was called From Conflict to Coalition, and it talks a lot about labor unions and international trade, specifically looking at when unions join their employers to lobby for the same trade policy. Mm-hmm. Right? So similar to this book, this idea that there's often class conflict within an industry about trade policy. So the steel workers might not always support a tariff for the steel industry, even though it's going to increase the profits of that industry, if they doubt that they're going to share in those profits. And so it's only when unions are powerful enough and sort of have a commitment from their employers that they'll share profits with workers that you get the kind of cross-class coalition that people often take for granted.
Okay. Well, so that's another book for people to read. This one is called Opening Up by Cracking Down Labor Repression and Trade Liberalization in Democratic Developing Countries. You are holding the book up at this very moment, Adam. I taught you well. Our audio, our podcast listeners can't see it, but it's a nice jacket. Hold it up again. It's a nice, university, presses don't always do a great job. Now, is that some famous mural?
That's a Diego Rivera mural from
right.
the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City.
Uh-huh. Nice book jacket.
Thank you.
Well, okay. Well, keep up the good work. Thanks for taking the time, Adam, and we'll see you again.
Thanks so much.